Meeting order being at 1 o'clock. Has everybody signed in that's on the committee? She's over here. Okay. We did receive email for confirmation of the open meeting law, so we are in compliance. And at this time, if there's anybody from the public that wants to speak, stand up, state your name, and.
Libby Stupak, I'm in the city of Old Tyre, and I don't know if anyone else saw it, but there was an article that appeared in the Wisconsin State Journal on February 28th that reported on research that was led by a U.S. Department of Agricultural microbiologist. And the study analyzed hundreds of polluted wells in Kewaunee County, but according to the research, the microbiologist determined that it's also applicable to all areas of Wisconsin and other areas in the Midwest that have porous bedrock. The conclusion was that farming and animal manure pose a far greater risk to drinking water than many other factors, such as septic. The research also found that the highest risk for coliform bacteria was the well's actual proximity to a manure storage site. So I think that's very important. It also mentioned that the wells built to draw deeper groundwater weren't less likely to be contaminated. And he said that you cannot construct yourself out of contamination by just by drilling a deeper well. So what I'm encouraging the study committee to recommend is a stronger animal waste storage and also management ordinance. I know that's something that you're looking at today. That would, if already not a requirement, that would require an impermeable lining to prevent leakage from a storage facility, to also address the practice of excessive land spreading near storage sites, which is one thing that was brought up in that research study. And also to require a design standard of a 100-year, 24-hour rainfall event, which has been scientifically recommended because of our changing climate and rainfall. Thank you.
Okay, and then I see Bev, you wanted to speak to?
I did. Bev still just in Fall Creek. And I guess, Craig, this is to you. As I'm reading all this massive amounts of information, you guys have quite a job ahead of you. In order to really make sense of it, I was wondering if you can tell me how many farms we have in Eau Claire County that have
Excuse me, Bev, but this is just for a comment section from the public. It's not a discussion, so
right.
Maybe you can get together with Greg afterwards.
Okay. Well, as the committee looks at this, I think we need to look at, I can't find anywhere how many farms we have between 500 and 1,000 animals as well. I think that as I am reading all the material, this seems to be a real critical area, as well as if we're going to do this, we might as well look at the whole package here. So I'll ask Greg afterwards for that number, and I just hope the committee takes into account that as well as I'm reading all your information. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Anybody else from the public want to speak? Anyone? Okay, if not, I would look for approval of minutes from our February 26th meeting.
Motion to approve.
Okay, we have a motion for approval of the minutes. All those in favor of that motion say aye. All right.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And at this time, I'll turn it over to you, Greg. Next item on the agenda is review of the moratorium process.
Okay, I wanted to provide the committee with an update on where we are with the moratorium. This did go out, this short calendar did go out with the agenda. The moratorium, the large-scale livestock moratorium is scheduled for 6 months, and that period will be ending on April 18th. We are today at March 12th. We currently have a resolution extending the livestock moratorium for an additional 2 months, which will go before the county board next Tuesday. It's already been to the Planning and Development Committee for approval, and it will go on to County Board for approval. If the County Board approves that, that will extend the actual moratorium until June 18th, which will be the 2-month extension. This is kind of an outline of the time of the events we anticipate occurring during this process, or during the remainder of this process for the rest of the year. We are today at March 12th. We're discussing revisions to our animal waste ordinance. Specifically, here in the next meeting, we'll be looking at livestock setting and CAFO specific topics, and potentially adding another meeting in the air if we need it for a wrap up. Part of the process will involve drafting the recommendations from this work group into ordinances or revision of existing ordinances. Those will be going to the Land Conservation Commission for review, for going to the Planning and Development Committee for review in April. Potentially those may have to come back to the LCC again in May, but the Planning and Development Committee could hold a public hearing. We're anticipating scheduling the public hearing of any revisions to ordinances for May 28th, in preparation for County Board presenting on June 4th, and then on June 18th would be the final County Board vote, potential approval at that time. So we have projected the future timeframes that we have anticipated, things that need to be done. Those are kind of the last dates of each of those to meet the due dates for the moratorium. If things go on quicker, we will move them forward as fast as we can. But with scheduling of LCC meetings and the Planning and Development Committee meetings, those are challenging also. We have schedules of those meetings we do have to follow, along with County Board. So I had included that outline within the packet. I hope you all had a chance to review it. Were there any questions about that? One thing we wanted, I was asked to remind the special committee. I was asked by County Board Administrator to remind this group of their the duration of the moratorium, which we just reviewed, and also the action and review during the moratorium. That the County Board of Supervisor directed this group to review and analyze the existing state and local regulations, to identify areas where new regulations may be needed, where current regulations need to be modified, where enforcement is inadequate, and then number 3, to identify who has monitoring and citation authority. So these are the action and review items which are asked of this group from the County Board. Some of the details of getting into scientific study was not identified by the County Board for us to pursue, but to try to review existing regulations. So I was asked by the County Administrator to review this again with the group. And we're actually supposed to review this with each meeting now. So I just wanted to review that once again with the group. Otherwise, what I did include with the agenda packet, for those of you who were here last time, this is a little bit of a review of what we discussed at the last meeting concerning NR 151. Some of the talking points and some of the remarks that came out of the group. Some of the concerns regarding NR 151A performance standards was, the first one there was that waterways are something that need to be addressed, but that is actually a concern that's already addressed within the nutrient management plan requirement for waterways to be addressed. So that concern was fairly well addressed. There was a question about the size, if there are size restrictions for direct runoff. In essence, NR 151 does apply to all size livestock operations, regardless if it's one animal unit or more. What constitutes significant discharge in NR 151. There's actually a computer modeling program known as Barney, which we use to predict barnyard runoff. It's based upon lot size, the use of the lot, the types of animals on that lot, the numbers, and what's happening on the downstream side of that lot for filtering. Significant discharge is defined as greater than 5 pounds of phosphorus within a water quality management area, or 15 pounds when you're outside of a water quality management area. And again, a water quality management area is anything within 300 feet of a stream or lake, 300 feet of a stream, 1,000 feet of a lake, or within an area that could be a direct conduit to groundwater, such as areas around wells and so on. There's a question about vegetative treatment areas, as we saw on the tour out at Sequin Valley Acres. If those are common practices for smaller operations, as they are with larger ones. In essence, vegetative treatment areas are a very common practice within our installation of best management practices in agricultural settings, and they are used, in essence, to control the runoff. What is a part of the NR 151 is that the VTA must control runoff below the significant discharge listed above to meet the standards of NR 151. Part of the concerns about the DNR does not have resources to enforce the law. Some of the talking points included county enforcement of NR 151. Are there ways to exempt smaller operations? That there are often enforcement tips that come from local members of the community into our office or to the DNR. Question if the county has resources to enforce NR 151. And also that environmental groups can provide education in addition to becoming the eyes and ears out in the community. There was a question about local farmers losing business, but this is a concern that's will beyond the scope of our local ordinances. One of the final questions was brought up about manure pumpers or haulers are not held accountable for spills that occur or equipment malfunctions. There is currently a certification process for pumpers and haulers, and I actually had Amanda do a little research on this. So Amanda, if you want to provide a little update.
Yeah, so I got in touch with Kevin Erb. He is with Extension out of the Green Bay office. Kevin is really involved in the Professional Nutrient Applicators Association of Wisconsin, and he gave me some insight. I can find my sticky note here. Here we go. On some of the requirements for pumpers and haulers when it comes to spills. So one thing that Kevin wanted to stress, especially for pumpers and haulers, is that it's important to remember that having a spill is not illegal. There are things that happen out there that are beyond your control, but what is illegal when it comes to having a spill is not reporting it and not taking the action to actually clean up spilled manure. Kevin did also mention that Wisconsin has one of the highest rates of reported manure spills, not because we have more manure spills than other states, but because there's that good understanding of you need to report it and take corrective action, and only the cases that were due to negligence will actually be brought further. So what I got out of Kevin is that when it comes to a spill, who's responsible according to NR 243, if it's a permitted facility, so this would only apply to CAFOs, it is the farm's responsibility. They cannot assign responsibility to whoever they hired to pump or haul their manure. So if they're a CAFO, it's their responsibility if there's a spill. For some of the smaller farms, then it gets to be that situation where they assess what caused the spill. Was it due to equipment malfunction, old equipment that hasn't been upgraded or inspected recently? Then it's probably the nutrient applicator's fault. But if it was something where the nutrient management plan that was given to them was incorrect, well, then it would be the farmer's fault. So it's for the smaller farms, it's more of a gray area of what caused the spill. He then got into some of the certification processes and some of the types of insurance that applicators are required to have. Basically, there's 3 different types of insurance. There is business liability, vehicle liability, and environmental liability. Like I said, Kevin's involved with the Professional Nutrient Applicators Association. And what they do is they hold trainings throughout the state on an annual basis. And people that are a part of this association come to the trainings and get certified. Once they are certified, there's 3 levels of certification that each require a different amount of training. Once they're certified, their insurance companies give them a discount on those liability rates. So it is a great advantage for the applicators to be certified through this association. They can get discounted rates. In addition to that, the insurance companies will also group them into either a high-risk company or a low-risk company, and that will also affect the premiums that they pay for their insurance. So, you know, it's a great benefit for the nutrient applicators to go through the certification program and get approved certifications, and it saves them a lot of money in insurance in the long run. What I learned, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
Did you have, in your conversation, did you come up with an average amount of spills per year in the state of Wisconsin?
Like a number, how many occurred? I did not.
Okay.
No, just that Wisconsin has one of the higher reported numbers. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that enforcement action occurred because of what was reported. An interesting stat, though, that I forgot to mention. So applicators that have employees certified through this training, those businesses see a 70% reduction in claimable losses from the North spills. So kind of an interesting stat. It's a good training program that they have.
When a spill was reported, is there any statistics kept as far as if the spill was reported by the producer or by the hauler or by a passerby?
Not that I'm aware of. That's almost, I would think that's something that you'd have to get from the DNR. So there's a state hotline out there, and it's a DNR phone number. That's how you typically report a spill, through that spills hotline.
So that information is maybe available, but probably not readily available.
Yes, that would be my guess.
Okay.
Mark, you have a question?
May I comment on that, Greg?
Sure.
It is public record. If you approach DNR, they do have breakouts of who made reports, when, what size, and where. It is public information.
Yeah, I figured as much. I never researched it.
Okay. that's
Any
all
other
I-
questions for Amanda? Thank you. You'll lead us with this, correct? Give me a minute, Amanda. We do have a couple of people online. And for me to share this online always gets to be a little challenging.
Yeah, but like I had the PowerPoint that she has, that was even out. Did you take it up there?
I don't know. It's not my business. Roll call, but- And Andy Ferguson is online.
All right, good to go?
Yep.
Okay. Again, I'm Amanda Peters, agronomist with Land Conservation in Greg's office. Today we're going to be talking about our current animal waste storage ordinance. It's chapter 1704, in our county ordinances.
Oh,
Oh, that won't work.
you just tell me and I'll move it for you.
Okay. So today, like I said, we're gonna be talking about our animal waste storage ordinance. But before we dive into that, I thought it was important to talk a little bit about the NRCS 313 standard as the standard that we use. We review manure storage plans to that standard when they come into the office. So I thought it was important to touch on what's all incorporated in that standard as well. Talk about our ordinances, things that we need to remove from the ordinance, and then items that we're going to leave up to you folks to discuss of things that we feel would be could be helpful for us to include into our ordinance. Gary?
Man, how much of NRCS 313 is in county code currently?
All of it.
All of it? Okay.
So our ordinance references, when you submit a plan,
Yep.
it needs to follow 313.
Okay.
So all of it.
And our existing ordinance references the most current version of NR 313.
Yes. Okay, so 313 is a very large standard that references several other standards. So to put it into one slide was kind of difficult, but what we're going to do is just talk about like very basic. When someone submits a manure storage, a permit for a manure storage, what are things that we're looking at in the plan? So the first thing is that there's going to be a site assessment included, and that's just a simple, where is the thing going to be? What's the landscape look like? And what are setbacks and separation distances to various features on the landscape? It also includes information about soil test pits. Depending on the size of the manure pit, there's a different amount of soil borings that need to be done and looked at to see what the soils are like under the pits, and then also to see what the separation is to bedrock and groundwater. Using information that they get from the site assessment, they're then going to determine if that pit is located in a sensitive environmental setting. Basically, these are going to be places that are, don't have good separation to bedrock or groundwater, or the soils underneath the pit are not incredibly tight. So this is going to be, a lot of pits are kind of going to fall in this sensitive environmental settings category. So once that happens, then you need to refer to other NRCS standards about how to line this pit. So NRCS 313 is kind of like, how do we dig the hole? Where do we put it? And then these other standards, 520, 521, and 522, are how do we actually line this hole? Each of those standards represents either a clay liner, a geosynthetic liner, or a concrete liner. So once you dig the hole, what are you going to line it with?
What's a geosynthetic liner?
Think of like a tarp plastic.
So what Sigmund's have at their farm? So
Sequence have?
That's what we have in our second pit. It's what Bush Brothers have in their wastewater treatment pit over on the other side of Highway 12. The same company did ours as did theirs at the same time.
It's in essence a plastic with earthen material. It's a combination of two,
Okay.
geosynthetic
Okay.
Yeah, so think of like heavy duty plastic.
Okay.
with earth in addition. It's not just the plastic.
Okay.
Right.
over it or under it?
Under,
Well, under it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about sensitive environmental settings. Then actually comes more of the, the engineering side of it. What is this thing gonna look like? What kind of concrete, if it's concrete lined, or if it's soil lined, what does that soil look like when it's tested in a lab? It's also gonna specify the amount of manure that needs to be held, and that depends on how that farmer is gonna manage their pit, how often they can empty it. So storage period, value, structural loading. So if there's going to be equipment in or around this pit, what sort of loadings, how heavy of equipment can it handle, things like that. And then the last part of reviewing a manure storage permit is, again, referencing another NRCS standard, and that would be the 590 nutrient management standard. So once you have your manure pit, how are you going to safely landify it? So that's also something that we look at when we review permits. Again, this is a super condensed version of what is in 313. This is all I was really going to touch on this. If anyone has any questions about it, if not, we will move on and talk about our ordinance then. Okay. All right, so keeping in mind that our ordinance references 313, anything that's in 313 is automatically in our ordinance. There's a few things that we do need to review. And one would be, you know, the applicable area of what our ordinance covers. Right now, it says that we cover the entire area of Eau Claire County, which means that it would include, like, in the city of Eau Claire, in the village of Fall Creek, everywhere. That's something that probably needs to be changed to just the unincorporated areas of the county.
Does that apply to unzoned townships too?
Yep, regardless of zoning, just anything unincorporated. So another section that we need to remove from our current ordinance would be section 8. So that gets into some of the plan requirements for when you submit a permit. Item E here says that people from our office will provide technical assistance for designing a manure pit. That's something that we really need to take out of there. That is not something that we typically do these days. When this ordinance was first drafted, land conservation departments did typically design manure pits for landowners, but nowadays that's something that we have the landowner hire out to private engineers. So we would like to remove that. And then there's also plan requirements that are specific in our ordinance that do not match up with 313 whatsoever. So things like how many soil pits are required, and some of the separation distances, they just don't match up. So we just need to pull that stuff out of there. Okay, so these next couple of slides, we are going to talk about things that staff from our office has identified as being potentially good ideas to put into or incorporate into our existing ordinance. And then if you notice, each one of these is labeled groups 1 through 4. So these are going to be some of the items that we're going to ask you guys to discuss later on after this. So this first set of items deals with pits that aren't being used anymore. The important thing that we need to do is better define what specifically is an idle facility. So this would be a manure pit, obviously, that isn't being used anymore. There's no new manure going into it. Our current ordinance says that after 3 years, it is considered an idle pit. NR 151 says 24 months. So I think that it would be good to have that align with NR 151.
Does your ordinance, the county ordinance, state that it's idle if it's not having manure added to or pumped out of?
What is the wording? I think it just says an unused manure pit. A pit that has not been used for 3 or more years is considered abandoned.
Right.
Because NR 151 states, I believe, that it's being added to or pumped out of. So if you was a devil advocate, you could get 47 months, just like Paul Manafort.
Okay, and could that go on into perpetuity?
It could,
You know, every 23 months you do a little bit?
but NR 151 also states that if the owner says that it's constructed properly, it could be maintained. It wouldn't have to be closed down. And as a group, we recommended accepting or proposing that the county would include NR 151. Is that something that we're going to accept? And that's what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. So you're right, there are some caveats in there. If you can prove that the pit meets current standards, even if it is idle, it can be, because it meet standards. It's not a concern for making manure. So again, this is a definition that would be nice if we had more clarity to it in our existing ordinance. And then potentially, you know, once that facility has been deemed idle, then giving some sort of a timeline of properly abandoning it after it has reached that point. And then that brings us into another NRCS standard. This would be 316 waste facility closure. So this is the standard that we use for how do you actually properly close a manure pit so that there's no concerns for contamination or no environmental concerns. So what this is looking at is how do you remove any wastes that are still in there, and then there's probably going to be some soil contamination with some of these older pits when you abandon them. So removing any potential contaminated soil in those pits, land applying it according to 590. How do you remove a liner? So if it's a concrete liner or some sort of a clay liner, how do you get rid of that? And then once you have this another big empty hole in the ground, what do you actually backfill it with? And how does that final grading look like so that there's no more potential for groundwater contamination after that pit is gone? Currently, our ordinance does not reference 360 whatsoever. It's implied, but it would be nice if it was very clearly spelled out that this is how we close a manure pit. Okay. All right, so the next item that I would like you all to consider is incorporating NRCS 634 waste transfer. So most manure pits do include a waste transfer system in them, and it's kind of already lumped into the design that gets submitted to us. But this is not something that's currently spelled out in our ordinance, that these waste transfer systems do need to meet this standard. So this is going to apply to any sort of a permanent like pipe, hopper, receptacle, pumps, things like that you're using to move manure from where it's generated to where it is going to be either land applied or stored for a period of time. It does not include things in the barn like alley scrapers, barn cleaners, things like that, but it would include any sort of hoppers or pumps. The requirements for 634 are very similar as 313. They're just a little bit more toned back just because of you're typically not dealing with as much manure in a pipe as you are in a pit, a stored manure situation, but very similar requirements. Any questions about waste transfer?
If I may just add one other thing,
Yeah.
Amanda. And part of the reason also the standards are a little less restrictive on transfer. The intention of a transfer system is not perpetually holding manure. It is a
Right.
transfer system that's designed only for holding it for short periods or during the movement, and it's not holding manure for weeks, months on end.
So this is, you would be talking about having something in place that if pipes come apart, what procedures are followed. At this point, there isn't anything. If it's transferring it from my barn to my pit or from my first pit to my second pit and the pipes would come apart as we're pumping, that's what you're saying is that's not addressed. How to handle that isn't addressed?
So what you're talking about is more of like an emergency response plan, which is something that would be included in this. But what I'm talking about, so say a new manure pit goes in, the engineer is required to give me the designs and specs of what that manure pit is going to look like. But technically right now, he's not required to give me what does that transfer system look like.
Oh, okay.
So
Now I
you're,
get it.
you're talking there, a transfer system from the barn, the facility to the pit? I mean, I don't understand exactly.
Yep.
I mean, I thought if it's anything that's attached to the storage, permanently attached, it would be considered part of the storage.
It's technically
structure.
considered, like I said, it's technically different. They normally do exist together. But there are slightly different standards for the two of them.
And so the other thing is, taking waste out. Now you're talking about some kind of transfer system there to get it into the truck or the hose. I don't understand that whole thing because I haven't seen, I don't know what you're talking about exactly.
I would say that the waste transfer system, as Amanda has described it, could be the pipe that comes from the barn to the pit.
Yeah,
It
okay.
moves the manure from where it's produced through a pipe over to the pit. Underneath our existing ordinance, we don't specifically address that piece, the waste transfer. An engineer today could place that pipe on bedrock with no protection measures.
Okay.
Theoretically, we probably would not let it, but that's not very clear today in our ordinance. We would like to incorporate what Nrcs currently has within waste transfer.
So that pipe from the barn to the
Manure pit.
pit.
So
Specifically, you're dealing with how deep it is in the soil or.
separation from bedrock and groundwater of that
Okay,
pipe.
okay. And then how about, what are you talking about in terms of getting it into the, well, to get it out of the pit, that's what I'm saying. What are you talking about there that you want put into the ordinance?
So the thing to remember is that this addresses permanent structures. So that buried pipe is not going to move. Typically, when you're emptying a manure pit, that's going to be some sort of a movable agitator, a pump that's on wheels that you're going to move in and out of the area when you're pumping and when you're not.
Okay, then we're not concerned about that. Is that what you're saying?
That scenario would not be addressed by this.
That's not a construction
Okay.
consideration.
Okay, because that's my area here that we're in.
Yes.
A small group. and
But
I'm
like
just
where we have at our farm, the pump and the load stand and all that stuff sits on concrete that is designed, that has a slope to it, that anything that spills on that drains back into the manure pit. That's more what you're talking about.
Yep.
That's an unloading ramp, not necessarily the pump itself. The pump is mobile.
Correct. Yeah, okay. But because if anything, if they run over a tanker or something, the manure doesn't go out over the field, it goes back into the manure pits.
Right.
Okay.
Now, something which we do not have within Eau Claire County, but I know other counties have, that fit into the waste transfer system, as Amanda has there, or cropland. There are facilities that have irrigation type manure pumping systems, but they have a flexible hose that's portable, and they're injecting the manure out on the agricultural fields. That's a portable system. That's not covered necessarily within our ordinance. There are operations that put a permanent pipeline from the pit out to a further location, and then they have the mobile pipeline that goes off of that system. So waste transfer would include that permanent pipe that goes from the pit out to some central location in a field.
Got a question, and it's sort of thinking about the perimeter of this, your sideboards here, but where you come in with a temporary filling equipment, you're filling your trucks and you're hauling them off. If you have that drain back pad, if there's a spill, you're covered. If you don't have a drain back pad and somebody isn't attentive and they overfill and it flows off, are there some safety measures that could be considered adding here, like automatic shutoffs or something, so that if somebody forgets, it's not a part of the permanent structure, but within the entire realm of, an animal waste ordinance, is something like that something this group can consider?
I don't know. I am not aware of any ordinances that do require anything like that. You're talking more about a safety measure.
Yeah,
If something does
it's
go wrong.
beyond this a little bit.
Yeah.
It's sort of an operational safety measure.
Is there, I think kind of what he's asking, is there any ordinance that governs the non-permanent equipment that is used with the manure?
I think at that point, it just comes down to either the farmer or the applicator using the equipment as it's intended and ensuring that there's no spills that occur.
Which I think goes back to Amanda's first discussion about the pumpers liability
Right.
certifications.
But, okay, so if we incorporate 634, where all of this was talked about, as far as the waste transfer go, and you take a scenario like Paul just brought up,
Mhm.
okay, that would be an existing farm.
Okay.
Okay, so if that was to happen and there was a spill, and now that we've got this incorporated, isn't that something that we could make them correct?
So
And that would address what Paul's bringing up.
this standard is going to get at how, let's see, what do I want to say? It's going to get at how do you construct that pipe? How do you size it? What sorts of pumps are attached to it? What separation distances in the ground do you need? How do you construct it? I believe I think what you're trying to get at here is once it's in the ground and then something does occur, what avenue do you have to clean up that spill?
Well, like an existing farm that hasn't followed any standard or something, didn't do like what Tammy has set up and stuff like that, and you do have a spill or like what Paul's describing, would this help Ojai County to enforce, to let's say, have them correct that, to do?
I think at that point it would
And-
almost fall under NR 151 that you don't have manure spills.
That could, Amanda's correct, it would fall under 151, but I have been exploring the opportunity. If Paul's got an existing manure pit per se, and we adopt changes to our ordinance, his pit was constructed and is already in.
Correct.
It is not affected by the ordinance.
Correct.
We have been exploring, and I know Dane County is also exploring the possibility of, if we adopt some type of an operational portion in the ordinance, where we could have someone such as Paul with an existing pit follow the current operating standards.
Which would be correcting the problem.
Which would be correcting the problem. It's a challenging legal direction to go because that's existing. And he's already operating it, and he constructed in 1997 according to the standards. We are bringing new standards and new regulations into place. It's challenging to legally bring that to today's standard. But now if Paul modified his manure pit, for example, today, and we had those things, then we can require it because he's doing a modification.
I've got another question about operations, since we're kind of on that subject. I also talked to Kevin Herb, and he's a great source of information. And he said that the two main factors which play into spills at the storage site are weather and just inattentiveness, are contributing factors. And he also said that spills at the storage site are more common on non-CAFOs than CAFOs. And one thing that CAFOs have is they have an inspection required that forces them to go out there and look at that pit once in a while. And maybe that's something that we could think about as an operational requirement. People get busy, They got other things to do. The pit is way back there. You can't see it unless you get up on top of the berm and look. That would fall into this realm of operational stuff. Again, it's not design. And probably most conscientious farmers do it anyway, but according to Kevin, it's a contributor to spills at structures that people just are inattentive and it happens.
So I have a question when it comes to that. So I know my parents have a pit at home and they would scrape the called platforms, but it's where the cows would stand. They would physically scrape that with the skid loader into the pit. So there was no like pumping because they would always have to look at the pit every single time they scraped into it. So how many, maybe Derek would maybe know how you guys did yours, but how much is it where you have, somebody has a pit where they don't have something that gets scraped into it, where they are actually looking at it? I guess with pit construction, I'm not an expert or anything, but where they're not actually there because when they're putting the manure into the pit, they have to look at the pit.
Well, this would have to basically, rely on the farmers here in the group. If you're going to do some sort of inspection requirement, what makes sense? I mean, requiring an inspection and something like that probably doesn't make any sense. But if you've got a pit that's all pumped, it's out of sight, I think that's what Kevin was talking about. So I just throw that out there as a consideration, how you would do it, frequency. I'd have to leave that to the farmers. What do you do? What makes sense?
This is how the spill happens at a non-CAFO. The manufacturer built the damn pump so that when it's in agitation, the 4-foot lever is up and the pit agitates. You drive under it and you fill your tank. Maybe you got multiple tanks. Sooner or later, if somebody's in a hurry and you're agitating that pit unattended, and that handle starts vibrating down. And then when the tank comes back, there's a big lake where you're filling. And then you got to walk in the lake, drive in the lake for the next week while you're unloading the pit. But that's something that I haven't looked at other pumps in a long time, but there'll never be another pump with the up agitation.
And that would be a permanent part of the installation, right?
No, that's a lagoon pump.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a
Portable.
portable,
lagoon
that's a
pump, and it
portable
was a
system.
stupid design and it was cheap.
So I think some of this conversation actually kind of blends into the next topic. Well, where we had the suggestion of potentially doing, go ahead,
Okay.
a certificate of use that we would incorporate into our ordinance. Not 100% sure what this would look like, but the concept of it is, so once you have your design and your permit and you constructed your manure pit, then you come back and submit some additional things to actually get a certificate of use saying that you can now use it, you can now put manure into it. Some of the things that we would look at receiving in order to grant the certificate of use would be the as-bills. So the engineer will submit plans to us of what they plan to put in the ground. Something always doesn't go according to plan. So the as-built is documenting what changed from the original plan to what actually went into the ground. And then with that, also having a nutrient management plan in place in order to use that pit. Some other ideas that we came up with were if there was rented land included in the nutrient management plan, having some sort of copies of the lease agreement or the rental agreement so the landowner understands that manure is being applied on their land. There's the potential for having the certificate of use renewed on an annual basis. The benefit of that is that the 590 is then also renewed on an annual basis. Right now in our current ordinance, it's implied but not explicit. So again, it would be nice if that was a requirement of everyone to always update that 590. And then it would also potentially be beneficial for us if to include enforcement options. If people aren't renewing these permits on time, we could do some sort of a late fee or a stop work order saying no more manure in the pit until we get your certificate of use squared away.
As far as getting the rental agreements, it's getting to the point now where the lenders are requiring a copy of the rental agreement, and it specifically has to say in the rental agreement, application of manure. We
Sure.
had to redo all of our leases last spring.
Change some of the wording on those.
Because it didn't have manure in it. It had nutrients in it, and the attorney said that was fine.
Mhm.
Banker said, no, it has to say manure.
Okay, so that would
So the-
align with what the
Yep.
lenders are requiring.
And that would just be for like, if you have a 3 or 5 year lease agreement, that wouldn't be something that you would expect to go back every year and get, would you?
Right. No.
Okay. Okay.
Now, ours is actually a 10-year lease, renewable every 3 years.
Okay.
And then you have 60 days. You have from, I forget where our lease will be, at 60 days from the start of the lease.
Yeah.
If either party isn't going to renew it, to notify the other party.
Yeah.
And if
Okay.
nobody says anything, then they just go on for
Right.
10 years.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions on this, and this is going to be tied to having a reviewable structure. Right? I mean, you have a storage structure that went through the review process and got approved. And then you, as opposed to like a daily haul operation,
Correct,
wouldn't get this.
correct, yes.
Okay. Another question, I can't think what it is now. Next report.
This is the part I mentioned earlier, which is challenging legally to have us go back on an existing structure to incorporate these certificates of use.
On that issue, are we going to have a clause in there regarding either permit revocation or penalties for failing and leaking existing facilities? In other words, is that what you're talking about? You've got existing facilities out there and they don't have to have the same standards because they're under the CAFO standard. So then if you were to specifically say failing and leaking existing facilities, of course, you still have to know how to get to determine what the failing and leaking
So
is done.
that's going to be kind of not a complicated situation, but when you get to the point where you have a manure pit that's failing and leaking, at that point, no matter what, you are in violation of NR 151.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's already covered under NR
It
151.
is covered under that, yeah.
If your pit is leaking in the sense that it's overtopping, that's a management error that can be addressed. If it's failing or leaking in the sense that there's a giant crack in the floor or down the sidewall, that's something where that manure pit then either needs to be removed or renovated to address that situation. At that point, once you alter an existing manure pit, then it comes through our permitting process. And then we would review it for all of these things.
But you wouldn't be necessarily inspecting those existing pits.
Not necessarily.
Oh, I thought of my other question. I mean, you could apply this to everybody who's got a pit, or is it also an option to put a size limit on this since you're adding something new? Would be all pits or just the bigger operations?
Yes, we could apply this to only certain size operations. But I would argue, regardless of the size of that manure structure, requiring proper certification of that structure being built properly, requiring us to see the proof of land rental agreements, having the nutrient management plan, that applies to all size pits regardless.
Yeah, they have that stuff already.
Yes.
So we're talking about adding this certificate of use process on top of all the structural review stuff.
I would see that this would be from our office administration of the animal waste storage ordinance, it would be beneficial for us to have this for every size manure pit, regardless of the animal units at that operation.
And the main part of it is having that nutrient management plan that's updated on an annual basis. It doesn't matter if you've got 10,000 gallons of manure or a million, it's still nice to have that plan.
Oh, does that still require cost sharing? So
Not underneath the animal waste storage ordinance.
Okay, well, that's good.
All right, last discussion item. So these items are more just kind of administrative things that would help us potentially administer this ordinance. We kind of talked about this already, the area that this ordinance applies to. Again, we should probably change it to the unincorporated areas of the county and not the entire area of the county. Another important thing to consider is NRCS standards do change. The 313 waste storage structure standard just went over a major overhaul in 2017. Now, when those changes occur, we need to know how they're going to reflect or how they're going to affect our ordinance. So will we adopt those changes simultaneously as NRCS adopts them? Is that something that the LCC, the Land Conservation Commission, should approve prior to us implementing those new standards? Or is that something that we wait to implement the new standards until AdCap 50 is updated? Now, if we wait till AdCap 50, keep in mind that that could be several years.
What is AdCap 50?
AdCap 50 is the state administrative rules for that the Department of Ag produces, which gives us land conservation certain authority and our LCC certain authorities. There are a couple of different ways in which we can have references to technical standards in our animal waste ordinance. One is that we reference the NRCS standards directly. So when the NRCS standard is updated, our ordinance becomes updated. That is what we have today. Another way is we reference the state administrative authority that gives the LCC authority to have a manure storage ordinance. So we're referencing a rule that says they have the authority. That AdCap 50 is slower in the updating process. There's a change in the 313 standard, but that will not occur within AdCap 50 until the state administrative rules are changed, which might be 2 years down the road. So the existing system we have, we reference the standard directly. So when the standard changes, our ordinance updates. Referencing to AdCap 50 is referencing a different system where we could have the authority to have these, adopting these rules.
The rules would only have to be implemented, like, not everyone would like have to that day fix what needs to be updated, but when they pull a permit,
Correct.
they change something.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
So they would know then, at least.
Yes.
Okay.
So thankfully, we didn't run into any issues to this last year when 313 was changed, but like the potential is, say someone is in the process of designing a manure pit, but they haven't submitted their permit yet. That engineer just spent hours upon hours designing that pit to the old standards, and then tomorrow the standards change, and then that design that they've been working on is no longer good. So having some sort of a grace period or something.
And you would get that grace period with the
Adoption
AdCap
by,
50.
by adoption by the LCC,
Yes.
a local adoption.
Okay.
Yes.
We did have one other instance which just happened here recently. The NRCS 313 standard was recently updated. Our ordinance says that we update as soon as it gets updated. NRCS had cost share programs going on which were referencing the old standard. They were allowing the NRCS organization itself was allowing people to potentially follow the old standard for the short grace period because that's what they signed up for their cost sharing, even though the standards changed. So our ordinance and our permit required follow the new standard. But their cost share program was saying you can still do the old standards. We didn't run into any problems, but that's a potential problem if we have instantaneous adoption because of sometimes these programs do not align with the calendars. So as staff, I would say very strongly consideration of adoption by the LCC in that consideration.
And I'd also like to add, you know, coming from the DNR, we ran into the same thing as DADCAP does, that in case of Department of Agriculture, the stuff comes down from NRCS. In the case of DNR, it comes down from EPA. And the process of trying to put that into a state administrative rule has become so complicated in the last few years that it almost doesn't happen anymore. It's that difficult. And so if you stick with the state codes, you're going to increasingly be implementing old information. You know, there's stuff in DNR that's been sitting for 10 years. And I don't know if it's that bad with DADCAP, but you know, if you go with the state citation and not the federal one, you're going to get out of sync with what technology's got out there.
So as we sit and try to consider making changes today, which of these takes preference? NR 151, 313, the county animal waste ordinance?
NR 151, in essence, sits by itself. Those are the egg performance standards and prohibitions. The NR 151 performance standards for manure storage facilities state that there should be no overflow, no leaking, be properly abandoned, and be constructed according to the current standards. We could just say in our ordinance, manure storage will be constructed to the current standards. But what should somebody submit to our office to prove that? Or what should somebody do to prove that they will be able to implement the nutrient management plan? These are the extra pieces which go beyond it NR 151, which we should incorporate into our animal waste storage ordinance.
So I think to answer your question, Mark, it's not a matter of like which one do we pick and choose. It's they all kind of work together.
Yeah.
But which one takes precedence when you are going to make a decision? Do you make this change or not? I mean, which one is, you know, we can't enforce a rule that's tougher than state standards, am I correct?
Correct.
So,
And the NRCS standards are not more restrictive than the state standards. So they fall in line with the state standards. There are some in the state who would argue that our manure storage ordinance today is already more restrictive than the state standards. Because this gets into the point that Paul just referenced. AdCap 50 actually references an old set of standards in NRCS for manure storage. Our manure storage references the today's standard, which is more restrictive than what was referenced in AdCap 50. So there are some people in the Department of Agriculture who argue that your existing ordinance is more restrictive than state standards. Technically, reading the letter of AdCap 50, they would be correct. But there are enough other references to current standards in state standard or state code that we are probably okay having more restrictive. So it's not necessarily more restrictive, only if you look specifically at a portion of state code. Did that make sense? I know that's a convoluted concept that we deal with in our
We're
office.
really getting in the weeds.
Yeah, we are kind of getting into the weeds, but that was a very good question.
What kind of weed are you talking about?
Industrial.
Oh,
You guys laugh once in a
Yeah.
while. You guys are way too serious.
you know, in the first one, when you're talking about the ordinance applies to the entire geographical area of Oakland County, how do you address, or maybe it's addressed someplace else, you know, animals within the city limits, like chickens?
So technically, that would be up to that municipality to enforce and monitor that.
Which is why we have invited folks from the village and cities into this work group so they're aware of these things.
So do we really want to exclude those cities, or how? You know, if municipality A says, I don't care what you do with your chicken coop, you know, can the county come in and say, if this doesn't apply to the whole geographical area, can the county come in and say, Mr. Chicken Raiser, you need to not pile your chicken poo on the curb or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
If we do not adopt our ordinances to include the villages, we're outside of the village and that's it. If there is a way to incorporate rules which would include the entire geographic area of the county, which our manure storage originally did. There are two different opinions if that is a valid way to administer an ordinance. Some folks at Department of Agriculture and the State Attorney General have given the opinion that a county cannot enforce manure storage ordinance within a village or city. Our Corporation Council review of the same statutes say that we do have the authority.
Right. Yes.
So that gets to be, okay. This is why people end up in court. There's different opinions on what the laws say. So we do, and we may have the ability to administer our animal waste storage ordinance and NR 151 within the cities and villages. But we could clearly go outside and have the cities and villages consider their own implementation of agricultural standards.
I've got one quick question for clarification.
Yes.
Over here on administrative items, you have applicability.
Mm-hmm. You have
And it
what?
says
Applicability.
applicability, what should we consider adding to AWO? And the first slide you talked about taking that out.
And putting it in. It's a question.
All right, 2 more bullet points, then you guys get to talk amongst yourselves. So enforcement options, right now, if someone, we normally see this more for closing an old manure pit than constructing a new one. If you're digging a new pit, someone knows about it. But when it comes to closing old manure pits, if that work gets done without getting a permit from our office, in certain circumstances, it would be nice if we had the ability to charge like an after-the-fact permit fee. So that's something that we could potentially add to the ordinance. And then the last thing would be, so this would be specific to farmers that do not have enough land to spread all of their, or excuse me, farmers that do have enough land to spread all of their manure on. We could consider granting them their construction permit to start building their manure pit, even if they don't have a fully completed 590 plan. And the reason being behind that is because sometimes that 590 is the hang up. That's the thing that they work on last. And it would be nice if, you know, construction season was ready to go and we could start digging that pit now. But that 590 is hanging them up. So in certain circumstances where they can prove that they have enough land to apply all of their manure on, we would wait to see the fully completed 590 until we did that certificate of use.
For example, if today Amanda came into our office, complete design, and she wants to begin construction manure storage on her farm as soon as the snow leaves, under our ordinance today, we cannot issue her a permit because she doesn't have soil samples to do the 590 plan. And that would not occur until after the soils and fields thaw out. So we could not technically issue her a permit to begin construction until she brought in those soil samples and then updated. But she could be losing out on construction time.
So the permit would
What
still,
would you have in place to make sure the 590 got completed? Would that be where you would go back to
To the
the as-built
certificate,
or the
Yep,
certificate?
and the
for use?
certificate of use.
Yep.
And we can do rule of thumb calculations based on cropland acres, livestock numbers, manure generated. Is there enough land?
just a real quick calculation.
We have those numbers for rule of thumb.
So
Currently, our ordinance does not allow us to follow that.
if you went with this, would you need to have the other operating plan? Or could this be just independent? And well, we'll do this, we'll give ourselves this authority separately, but we'll require a complete 590 plan before you put any manure in it.
Before the certificate of use, yes.
And you could do that without, I'm trying to see the extent to which these two things are separate. You know,
They do kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
It kind of goes hand in hand with certificate of use.
Yes.
Correct.
So you're gonna have two certificates, you're gonna have a permit,
For
And then-
construction,
construction, and
Yes.
then a,
certificate for
and
use.
you haven't talked about raising that fee for the initial permit. Is that gonna come up in one of our sessions?
Our permit fees in Eau Claire County are based upon our administration of an ordinance
Mhm.
and in essence recouping our costs. We are not charging an arm and a leg, we're covering our cost to administer an ordinance. So fees are based upon our time and commitment that's needed to review and administer.
So it's
the-
not a standard one size fits all, in other words. Do you have a range of,
No, we have two rates, one for a pit abandonment and one for a pit construction.
mhm.
We may consider a range if staff, as we review what it takes to administer the potential changes, does it justify a change?
Well, I'm just thinking, you're talking about a one permit, one charge before the construction is started, right?
That would be for the construction.
Well, I'm just thinking of Green County where the land conservationists had to go out to the site time after time after time because in the construction they were not, they had some big areas of issue. And so I saw his time listed in the newspaper. It was tremendous. So, can you put anything in there, that the construction, obviously you're gonna go out and take a look at it while it's being constructed.
We just built a new facility within the last year and a half. The private engineer that you hired is the one that's on site documenting that we're paying for all that. Then he compiles all the information and gives that to them as an as-built report. So they personally aren't out on site when we're constructing the pit. We as the farmer, we were paying the engineer to stand there, check all the rebar, check the concrete and everything as it was built, and then that report gets sent to them.
Well, this was it was a question of the siting on a very low piece of land. And what wasn't meeting the specifications was it was too close to the groundwater. And the pits would have had to have been inspected to see what their groundwater issues were. And
That's
maybe
all.
the engineer was reporting that, but he was out there time after time after time to get them to
I
correct
mean,
it.
this book right here, front to back, cost me about $40,000 to construct the manure pit in Eau Claire County. This is all the engineering, all the time and effort.
Yeah,
that
but
went
I'm
into
just
this.
talking about really bad actors. I'm not talking about, you know,
It's almost impossible to be a bad actor in the system as a person that just went through this. You can't cheat the system. It's just about impossible.
well, they tried.
But they got caught, didn't they?
Okay,
After about
so-
50 trips out there.
If there's no more questions about the items up for discussion today, then what I think, hand it over to Greg.
Yep.
And then we'll get into our small groups. We can discuss these items and potentially others.
I'll make one comment on what you are requesting, Eleanor, is known as an open-ended fee, which our chapter or Title 18 in the county administrative code, the zoning code, is currently going through review, and the consultants chastise the county for having open-ended fees. Okay, I'll just make that
Well,
comment,
you
okay?
know, I'm just thinking of in terms of the cost to staff, and it could be prohibitive.
So what we're gonna do, we're not gonna group, we're gonna change things up based on the number of people here. We're not gonna go into 4 groups. We're gonna go into 3 groups. Right down this side, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right across the back there, 1, 2, 3, 4. Steve, you're over on this side. 1,
That was my other question.